Okay, let's dig in. The classic Maya civilization. I mean, it's just endlessly fascinating, right? You've got these amazing cities, the writing, but also that big question mark over how it all sort of declined.
Absolutely. And Copán, the site in western Honduras we're looking at today, is really central to that whole story.
It really is. Kind of sits at a crossroads, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And it has this incredibly deep history. People were there way before 1000 BCE in the early pre-classic.
But it really ramps up later.
Right. Early classic, say 300, 400 CE, that's when you see the big monuments, the Maya-style inscriptions really starting to pop up.
Okay. And then comes the founding dynasty. This figure, Kinichiaks Kukmal. He arrives around 426, 427 CE.
And the sources are pretty clear he wasn't local, an outsider, they call him. He relocated there and, well, started this dynasty that lasted about 4 centuries.
400 years. And Copán just booms during that time. Peak population, maybe 30,000 people. That's huge for the time.
It's a major center, yeah. And for ages, the idea has been that these kingdoms, like Copán, weren't just purely local developments.
You mean like people moving in?
Exactly. Incoming Maya elites mixing with the folks already there. And we've had hints of this, from archaeology, the inscriptions.
There's isotope studies too, right?
Yeah.
Showing people grew up somewhere else.
Right. Isotopes in teeth and bone, they trap the chemical signature of the food and water from where you grew up. So, yeah, studies showed some Copán elites, even early rulers, weren't raised locally.
But isotopes only tell you about that person's childhood, not their deep ancestry.
Precisely. They don't tell you about, like, great-great-grandparents or if their descendants stuck around.
And this is where our deep dive really gets interesting today, because we've got these sources focusing on some really cutting-edge ancient DNA work from classic Copán itself.
Yeah, from people who actually lived there back then.
So our mission is to unpack what their DNA tells us about, their ancestry, migration, maybe even that famous collapse. The science is aiming to, as the researchers say, sharpen this picture.
Exactly. DNA gives us that direct line to inheritance, a way to track population history, movements, mixing over the long haul, not just first-generation migrants.
Okay, so the million-dollar question first. How on earth do you get usable DNA from people who lived, over 1,000 years ago?
Well, the key is knowing where to look. They focused on a part of the skull called the petrous bone.
Petrous bone.
Yeah, it's near the inner ear, incredibly dense bone, really well protected. So it's often the best bet for preserving ancient DNA. They took samples from 16 different individuals buried at Copán.
16 samples taken.
Yeah.
But how many actually worked? Ancient DNA can be tricky.
That's true, but they got good results from 7 individuals, enough high-quality DNA for the really detailed analysis.
7. Okay, maybe not a huge number, but potentially packed with information. Who were these 7 people? Were they all elites or?
Yeah, it was a mix, actually. They came from different structures, different parts of the site, and they spanned a good chunk of time from the early to middle classic right through to the middle to late classic. So, covering a lot of that dynastic period.
And socially? Were they rich, poor?
Most didn't have obvious signs of, major wealth in their burials, but the sources really zoom in on 2 individuals found near each other, and they're quite the contrast.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading about those two. Tell us about them.
Okay, so one, they labeled CPM-13, found in a proper royal-style tomb, had the highest wealth designation score. They used a 5. Lots of status markers, valuable grave goods. They think this person was likely a member of the ruling dynasty.
Wow. So potentially royalty. And the other one?
Right next door, basically, labeled CPM-12. But this one had a wealth score of 0-1. Nothing indicating status or wealth in the burial itself.
0. So a really stark difference.
Yeah, and based on the context, the location, the researchers interpret CPM-12 as potentially a sacrificial offering.
Whoa. Okay, so you've got maybe a royal figure buried right near someone potentially sacrificed. That's powerful. Their DNA could tell quite different stories, or maybe a linked one.
It's a fascinating pairing.
Did they double-check the DNA was actually ancient?
Mm.
Not, contamination from archaeologists or something?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. They ran rigorous checks, confirmed it was genuinely ancient DNA, minimal modern contamination, and they looked at the basic genetic markers, the haplogroups.
Did they fit the picture?
They did. The 2 males, CPM-12 and CPM-13, had mtDNA and Y chromosome types A2, C1, and Q1b that are super common in indigenous American populations today. So first check. These individuals definitely belong in that ancient American genetic landscape.
Okay, makes sense. So they've got these 7 genetic profiles spanning different times, maybe different social statuses. What happens when they compare this DNA? What are the big headlines?
Well, one of the really striking things, maybe something we didn't fully grasp before the genetics, is this evidence for really deep and strong genetic continuity right there in the Maya region.
Continuity. Like the same people sticking around for a long time. How long?
A really long time. The analysis suggests a continuous genetic thread stretching all the way back to the late Archaic period that's like 5,600 to 3,700 years ago.
Oh,
Yeah. Right through the classic period folks at Copán, linking up with later Maya groups and even present-day Maya people in Mexico. The Copán individuals basically cluster right in with this long-term local population.
so underneath all the dynastic changes and stuff, the actual genetic bedrock of the population was incredibly stable for millennia.
It seems so. That core local ancestry just persisted.
That's amazing. But okay, we know people moved. We talked about the founder, Kukmo, being an outsider. Did the DNA pick up on that kind of movement into Copan?
It does, absolutely. While that local continuity is the main signal, they also found clear evidence of gene flow from elsewhere contributing to the Copan gene pool.
Ah, okay, so where from?
The signal pointed towards ancestry related to populations in highland Mexico. Think areas like Oaxaca, groups like the Zapotec.
Highland, Mexico. Okay, so the DNA is confirming a connection to that specific region. How much? Was it a huge influx?
At Copan, they estimated this highland Mexican-related ancestry makes up about 6.1% of the genetic mix, give or take a bit. And it looks like this started coming in around the early to middle classic period and continued.
6%. How should we interpret that? Does it mean like 6 out of 100 people were straight from Mexico, or is it more mixed in?
Yeah, good question. It's more the second one. It's not like you had distinct groups living side by side necessarily. It means that over generations, enough people with that highland Mexican ancestry moved in, mixed with the local population, had kids, that their genetic signature became part of the average Copan ancestry, about 6% by the later classic period they sampled.
Gotcha. So it's evidence of ongoing mixing and integration over time. It backs up the archaeology and isotope hints, but with like real genetic numbers.
Exactly. It adds that precision, showing connections beyond just first-generation immigrants.
And was this highland Mexican influence the same everywhere in the Maya world? Or was Copan different?
That's interesting, too. The study found this ancestry was actually stronger, more concentrated in Maya populations further north, places like Chichen Itza in the Yucatan.
Ah.
Yeah. By the time you get down south to Copan, that signal was, as they put it, diluted. So it suggests this network of interaction stretched far, but the genetic impact lessened the further south you went.
Okay, that paints a picture of these connections.
Yeah.
Now, besides ancestry, can DNA tell us anything about population size?
Yeah.
Like, did the number of people go up or down?
Yes, it can give us clues about that, too. They used a technique called IBD analysis, identity by descent.
IBD. What does that do?
Basically, it looks for long, identical segments of DNA shared between different individuals. The more related people are in a population, the more and longer segments they tend to share. By analyzing these patterns over time, you can infer changes in the effective breeding population size.
Okay. And what did the IBD analysis show for the Copan region?
It showed a period of population growth which seemed to peak around 1,221 years before present.
So roughly 800 CE or so.
Right around then. And the inferred effective population size reached about 19,000. Now, that's a genetic measure, not the census count.
Which might have been 30,000 or more at Copan's peak.
Exactly. But it's a strong genetic indicator of significant population expansion in the region. And the sources suggest this growth could be linked to things like that gene flow coming in, plus the intensification of maize agriculture, which we also see in isotope data showing diet shifts.
Okay, so growth up to a peak around 800 CE.
Mm-hmm.
And then, well, the elephant in the room, the classic Maya collapse. Does the DNA speak to that?
It does, and this is maybe the most dramatic finding. The same IBD analysis revealed a really sharp and significant population decline starting roughly 1,200 years ago.
1,200 years ago. Yeah, hang on. That's almost exactly the same time as the peak growth they saw. Or just after.
Just after the inferred peak, yes. And that timing around 1,200 years ago, or the 9th century CE, is critical. Because, as the study points out, this genetic signal of a major population crash perfectly coincides with the start of the classic Maya collapse, that period from the 9th to 11th centuries when so many cities declined or were abandoned.
Wow. So the DNA is showing direct biological evidence of a massive population drop happening right when the civilization was facing crisis.
Pretty much, yeah. It's
Yeah.
a genetic echo of the collapse. The sources link this finding to the factors we already suspect were involved: major droughts, social instability, the usual suspects.
Right.
They do add a caution, though. This genetic signal is like an average for the region they sampled. It doesn't necessarily capture, local variations in exactly when or how badly the collapse or droughts hit different specific areas.
Of course, yeah. So let's try and weave this all together now. We've got this deep local genetic continuity going back thousands of years,
Mm.
then clear evidence of people moving in from highland Mexico and mixing, then growth peaking around 800 CE, followed immediately by this sharp genetic decline matching the collapse.
Mm.
How does all this sharpen the picture, as they say?
Well, it gives us this much more dynamic, nuanced view. It confirms, like the researchers say, both the enduring persistence of local ancestry, that stable foundation was real, but also the reality of broader mobility. People were moving, connecting over long distances, well beyond just the Maya area. That highland Mexico link is concrete proof.
So it wasn't just locals or our migrants. It was both happening together.
Exactly. That long-term continuity plus the gene flow evidence really supports that model of Maya kingdoms like Copán growing through an amalgamation, a mixing of local people with newcomers from this wider Mesoamerican network. The DNA kind of validates those older archaeological ideas.
Oh, it's really powerful data. But like all science, especially ancient DNA, the researchers themselves pointed out some limitations, didn't they?
They did, yeah. They're very upfront about it. First, the sample size 7 individuals with good DNA is amazing, but still small. And some samples had low coverage, meaning the genetic information wasn't perfectly complete.
Okay, small sample size. What else?
They also mentioned the wealth designation scores might be a bit tricky.
How so?
Well, most Maya burials are archaeologically considered sort of low rank, so just using their numerical score might not capture all the social nuances, except for the really obvious elite ones like CPM 13.
Right, it might oversimplify things a bit. And the sampling itself.
Yeah, they noted it wasn't strictly random sampling across the entire population. They focused on specific burials and structures. So, to get the full picture of Maya genetic history, you'd ideally need way more samples from more sites, more time periods, different social contexts. A massive undertaking.
Understood. Important caveats to keep in mind. But even with those 7 individuals, the insights seem pretty profound.
Oh, absolutely. It takes things that were inferred or hinted at and gives them solid biological backing.
Okay, so let's recap the core takeaways from our sources today. Ancient DNA from Copán basically confirms people were moving into the Maya region, specifically showing genetic ties to highland Mexico. It also reveals this surprisingly deep local genetic continuity stretching back millennia. And maybe most powerfully, it provides hard genetic evidence for a major population crash right around the time of the classic Maya collapse.
Yeah, it turns inference into something much more tangible.
So when you think about this whole story, the DNA is telling this mix of deep roots, long-distance connections, growth, and then that sharp decline. How does that make you think about cultural continuity? And maybe about how even really complex societies can be, well, fragile when faced with big environmental or social shocks? What does this ancient story maybe tell us today about human resilience or adaptation across the long sweep of time?